Hello, my name is Sara Piasecki, and I'm currently working as an archivist with the National Park Service Alaska Regional Office in Anchorage, Alaska. But the project I'm about to discuss is one that I had the privilege of developing when I was the archivist at the Anchorage Museum from 2011 to 2019. In the past, when I have talked about this project, there's always been the opportunity for face-to-face real-time discussion. I tend to speak off the cuff, and I always enjoy responding to questions. So the conversation would go where listeners wanted it to go. It would become community talking about community. But since we can't do that here, I've put both my personal contact information and the contact information for the Anchorage Museum slide. If you're interested in learning more about any of the images that I will be sharing here, or about the finding aids, or about the current status of the project, please reach out to museum staff. If you have questions about how we developed the process or how we adapted and responded to feedback, feel free to reach out to me directly. Okay, so let's get started. This is where I start talking off the cuff, so please bear with me. I want to give you a little background on what it was like at the Anchorage Museum when I started there. So the Atwood Resource Center is the library and archives for the Anchorage Museum. At that time, there were 2 full-time professional staff, 1 full-time paraprofessional staff person, and a part-time scanning technician. Primarily, the mission was to serve museum curatorial and exhibition needs. So if people needed an image for an upcoming show, they needed to do research into a topic, that's who we were primarily there for. But the archives and library was also open to the public for 16 hours per week. And we did email and phone reference for 40 hours per week. And we had more public requests for information than we had from internal museum staff. The archival collections at the museum were large, primarily photographic. There were, at that time, about 750,000 photographs in the collections. And they dated from the 1860s up until, the present. We were taking in new images all the time, about 10,000 new images per year. They came in various formats, negatives, prints, daguerreotypes, and they showed towns and villages really all across Alaska, Northwest Canada, and the Russian Far East. So those were really the core collecting areas for the archival images. The problem we had, or one of the problems we had, was that many of those photographs had little or no description with them. They were taken in long after they had been created, and museum staff and volunteers could only identify so many images of Anchorage's main street, images of Fairbanks, some of the more populous towns, famous people, Ted Stevens. But there were many, many images that we had no idea what they showed. And many of those images had been given by donors who may have had information, but they had perhaps passed away or moved out of state, and we could no longer contact them. And there were many of these photographs that were taken not that long ago. So maybe not 5 years ago, but 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And we knew that the people who could help us identify those photographs were slowly disappearing as well. So we really needed help as quickly as possible to try to identify some of these photographs. So part of the problem in reaching out to communities to get descriptive information about photographs is that Alaska is a pretty big state. It's difficult to travel to some places. And unfortunately, the way copyright law is written these days, if you take a photograph that you don't have the rights to and you post it on Facebook or on your website, that is considered a form of publication, and that is an infringement of copyright law. Many of the photographs that the museum had were in questionable copyright status. Either the museum clearly didn't have copyright, or we didn't know who had copyright. So at the time that the collections were taken in, no one thought to ask for copyright. That was never part of the donor form, because as time went on and copyright law changed and became more restrictive, those ideas evolved. And so a lot of the early collections that we had come with no paperwork, no rights, and no way to contact the donors to obtain rights. So if we couldn't put them online, we needed to find a way for people to look at physical photographs. So how are we going to reach people in far-flung locations? Because many of the photographs were from outside Anchorage, from outside the rail belt, off the road system. We couldn't fly to Nome and Ukjavik and Juneau to try to get people to look at these things. But my colleague in the library at the Anchorage Museum at the time was a woman called Teresa Williams. And Teresa knew about AFN, the Alaska Federation of Natives, and their annual convention. And she had been to AFN in years past, and she suggested that it might be a great idea to see if we could get a vendor table there and bring some photographs and have a bunch of people from various villages and towns look at photos all in one place at one time and just see how that would go. So we applied for an ILC grant, an interlibrary cooperation grant, for fiscal year 14. So as some of you know, those ILC grants are IMLS funds, so Institute of Museum and Library Services funds, and they're administered through the state. So we applied for one of those grants and we got one. And it was going to fund a vendor table at AFN, which was going to be in Anchorage that year, and also a small event at the Anchorage Museum itself. So that year, so it was fiscal 24. So in October of 2013, we geared up to go to AFN, and we took 441 photos. So that was literally me scanning those images and printing them out on paper to take to AFN to get some feedback on. And I'm fairly new to Alaska. In 2013, that had been my third year in state. And I recognized some things and not others. So I split them into very broad categories, and I just made a bunch of folders and I broke them down into Nome and St. Lawrence Island, interior and East Alaska, Northern Alaska, South Central, Southeast, Western Coast, Aleutians and Kodiak, and then like unknown. Like I have no idea where this might have been taken. And then in 2019, as I'll mention later on, we did wind up changing those broad geographic categories into categories that reflected Alaska Native Corporation boundaries. But this is how we started in 2013. So how are we going to get people to the table? We offered them free photos. So the idea was that if you wanted to come over and take a look at some of the photos we had, we would print 2 of them for you on lovely glossy 8x10 paper, and we would send them to you. And we asked everybody to fill out a little survey, because grants often require you to gather quantitative information. So we needed a little survey instrument to ask people why they stopped at the table and if they thought it was interesting and would they do it again. And this is how it went. We were mobbed. There's Teresa in the center, And she is surrounded by more people than we had chairs for and more people than we could count. It was she and I, and we decided to try to just count people with little hash marks on a piece of paper, and that quickly became totally untenable. We were busy handing people pencils and sharpening pencils and answering questions and taking feedback and handing out folders. And we had some people come and sit for a long time. This is myself speaking to an elder from EEC who probably sat at the table for an hour in between sessions and looked at almost everything. He just was interested in looking at old photos, and he had a lot of really great things to say about not necessarily exactly who someone was or where it was taken, but talked about dances and clothing and subsistence practices. And I remember at one point he began to sing quietly to himself, and it was a wonderful moment to see him enjoy the photos. So at the end of the 3 days, I think we set up on a Wednesday. We were there a Thursday, a Friday, and a half a day Saturday. There were just too many people to count, and there were hundreds of people who had come. And of the 441 photos that I took, 250 were identified in whole or part. So either maybe somebody knew where it was, but not who it was, or who it was, but not where it was. You know, we got some information there. It was identified in part, which I think is astounding for me, just having no real sense of what could be identified. Just really serendipitous people walking by who happen to know somebody. Really astounding, I thought. And we gave 223 prints away. A lot of people said, no, I don't need anything, but many people wanted images of family members or people they knew to be sent to them. So between 2013 and 2018, we went to AFN every year as a result of the success of that first visit. After the first year, when we went with grant funding, the Anchorage Museum funded it out of its operational cost. So the vendor tables at AFN were $2,000, and you know, we sent multiple staff when AFN was in Anchorage, and we sent 2 staff when it was in Fairbanks. So it was a significant undertaking for the museum to maintain this program. And over the course of all those years, we took almost 3,000 photographs, 2,940 photographs. And of those, 1,607 were identified, or again, about half, 54%, which I think is astounding given the size of Alaska, the overturn in the population, and just the random nature of what I think might get a response from people. We had 391 individual people request prints, and we sent out 824 images to those people. We also went in 2019, which was right before I wound up leaving the museum. But I don't know whether those stats ever got compiled, because as many of you know, spring of 2020 was the start of the pandemic, and you know, one thing after another. So to talk a little bit about how successful this was, not just in terms of numbers, but just to give you a sense of the real connections that were made, of connecting people in various villages and towns to their own pasts, and connecting communities to their visual history, and even connecting people to one another. I just have a few examples here of some of the success stories. So here is Nora Velez, and she is on my right in color, and she is holding a picture of her mom. And this photograph had come in a collection from Mary Brew, who had written a book about her own mother, Etta Jones. And she was Mary Brew was a very good researcher. And Etta Jones lived in many of these places. Despite the best intentions and really historically minded individuals taking the photographs and donating the photograph had been identified as a girl in Attu. And that's the way I took it to AFN, as Attu, but who is this girl? And not Attu at all. It turns out to be Old Harbor. And it's Lucy Kelly. And we've essentially corrected the historical record here, because this one showed up in Mary Brew's book as being a photo of Attu, and it's not. And the best part about that, though, is Nora getting to see this photo of her mom, which she had never seen. This image was in the unknown folder, because as you can see there, it's sort of a corrugated metal building and there's snow. I mean, that could really be anywhere in Alaska, to my mind. And there's a man who appears to be in military dress, and he's hugging two young girls. And the two girls came to the table. They happened to be at AFN. They happened to have some time. They were looking through photos. They're like, oh, sure, I'll check the unknown folder. And they identified their father and themselves. And in the picture on the right, you can see three of the children there standing and looking at the photo. And we wound up sending this print to everyone in the family. This image, I knew where it had been taken because it was taken by a professional photographer named Don Horter, who did some really beautiful work for many of the airlines in Alaska in sort of the middle of the 20th century. And this was part of a promotional campaign for WEEN, Northern Consolidated, where they were taking tourists out to remote areas and exposing them to Alaska Native culture. And so these two women were out on a beach for tourist entertainment, truly. And Don Horter, being a marketing photographer who was not from Alaska, he would come up seasonally. He made beautiful images, but he was not interested in capturing information about the culture, really. So he did not write down the names of these women, and he just took their picture, and it was used for marketing purposes. And so on the right, you can see a very sort of it's Teresa taking a photo of Reba holding a photo of herself and her friend Clara. And Reba sat down and she saw this image of herself and her friend, and how beautiful they used to be, is what she said. And a little gentleman sitting next to her said, "You're still very beautiful." And this is one that also made us chuckle. This was a later year. This was not in 2013. But we had received, the Anchorage Museum had received a collection of photographs from photojournalist Fran Durner, who had done a lot of stories around the state. And as a photojournalist, she took really good notes on many of the subjects that she photographed. However, when she went out to cover a story about whaling, she captured the names of the captain of the crew and some of the other individuals, but not everybody who was on the crew. And so there were many images of other crew members, and they were fairly contemporary. So we took them, and Charlie Brower sat down at the table and identified himself, and he just he got a real kick out of himself, and he kept saying, "Yep, that's me when I had hair." And he just was so tickled with seeing these images of himself. And of course, we provided copies of these to him to have, because he had never seen them. They'd never been published. And, you know, again, not taken without his permission, but taken and not shared. And it wasn't just people that we had success with, but this was an image. Again, sometimes you take images somewhere hoping that someone will help you identify them. And this was a very small community. It obviously was southeast, but I had no idea what it might have been. And a gentleman sat down and he immediately identified it as Myers Chuck. And I had never even heard of Myers Chuck, and I had to look it up. And only 20 people even lived there in 2000. And the man who happened to sit down at the table lived in Myers Chuck. He grew up there. He could point to his house. He pointed out what all of these buildings were. I no longer remember, but he wrote down for us as much information as he could about Myers Chuck and its history and all of these buildings. And it felt like such a win for the people of Myers Chuck to be given this photograph, and for the museum now to know what this was an image of. And sometimes it wasn't even about the photographs. This is a photo that I took kind of hastily. Two gentlemen reaching across the table here to shake hands, because they happen to be sitting there looking at the same photos and recognizing the same people in the photographs. And at some point, one of them says to the other, "Who are your parents?" And they realized that they were cousins and they had never met. So that was the kind of connection that we were able to make through this project. So beyond all of the heartwarming success of connecting people to their past and connecting people to one another and connecting communities, the Anchorage Museum got a lot of really good information from this project. And what were we going to do with it? It's a lot of resources. As I mentioned, it's $2,000. It's 2 people for 3 days. It's an enormous amount of time to prepare, to go. You select images and scan them and print them out. And we printed them out on paper, regular paper, so that people could write on them with pencil. That was the most accessible method for commenting. People don't want to go through a lot of effort to write something down. And sometimes they want you to write it down. They just want to tell you and walk away. So we had pieces of paper with lots of handwriting on them. Sometimes people were in a hurry. Sometimes people were standing up holding the piece of paper, as you could see in the pictures where not everybody had a chair. So we would come back with this information, and we had to decipher all that handwriting. We had to reconcile conflicting information, because not everyone agreed with what the history was, or who the people were, or what the locations were, or when it might have been taken. So we had to do a lot of verification, and by we, I mean me, pretty much, to find out what would be the spelling of this person's name. Is that how it was spelled? Looking in telephone directories, looking in census records. Is that a name of an actual place? What happened to that place? It moved, or it eroded. It's no longer there, or that's just another name for, this is the official name of the place, but this is a more of a local name for a place. We had to try to turn all of that information into something that could be useful, right? To try to make it the way someone would search for it, to make it all regular spelling. So once we did all of that, we would update the collection guides. So, and I'll show you this in a minute. I have some examples of how these would look, but we would take all of this information and we would just embed it in the collection guide. It's not me saying that this is, George Jackson. It's somebody else at AFN in 2013 who identified this as George Jackson. And so all of that information went in there, so it could be carried with the information about the collection as researchers used those collections in the future. So I always noted who said what and when, especially if someone came back later and said, no, that's not who that is. I want to see, who said that. We never captured names of participants who offered information, but I could pull out that photo from that year and show someone the handwriting of what information was added. So this is what the Anchorage Museum website looked like at the time, and I believe still does. It was just a list of all of the archival collections in accession number order, which is not a very useful or user-friendly display. But up in the top right corner of the screen, there was always a little search box, and you could type search words in there, and it would bring back any finding aid or guide that had that phrase or that word. So this is an example of a single finding aid where up front there's a lot of information about what the collection is, when it was donated to the museum, how big it was, any background about the donor or whoever created the photographs. And then below all that sort of administrative information, there's an item level description of each photograph. So that's the level to which the Anchorage Museum went in describing its photos. It was a photo by photo, because the collections were so image heavy, and that's what they were used for. It was not really sufficient to say, I have a folder of images of Sitka. You wanted to know what views in Sitka, what buildings, what people. So each one of those would be individually described. And so here in this particular example, you'll see in photo number 11, man wearing parka, mucklucks, and driving cap standing outdoors at AFN 2014, tentatively identified. So that usually means somebody put it down and said, maybe, question mark. And for every piece of information I would get, it would be added in this way. So we would add the information to the physical object as well, if necessary or if possible. If it was a printed photograph, we'd write on the back of the photograph. If it was a negative, it was in an envelope, we'd write it on the envelope. Earlier collections had actual catalog cards, a little 3x5 catalog cards. Sometimes we would update those catalog cards. Some of these images had already been posted on the Alaska Digital Archives, and we would update the records there. And then we would update those finding aids as well. And I had kept all of those individual printed out photographs as well, just in case, I'd had trouble deciphering handwriting and I wanted to go back. So what did we learn in the process of doing this that I could share with you that might help if you decide to do this yourself? Plan as far in advance of your event as you can, really, because if you are always on the lookout for images that might be good candidates for identifying in this way, when you come across them, you can scan them and print them out. I found that in years when I had to go back and rummage around looking for candidates, it always took a lot longer than if I had been kind of working on it all year long, and just creating little piles for taking to AFN. we would assign individual accession numbers to each image. So that was something that, sort of the archival processing that would need to go into these collections before you could refer back to them. And it was really important to be organized. So as I mentioned, when we started, I took 441 photographs. I couldn't just hand 441 photographs to a person who came to the table. Nobody wants to look at that many. People didn't really want to look at more than 20. I mean, there were very few people that wanted to sit for that long. So I had to break it down into categories, some sort of method that would make sense to the users in your community. Is it going to be by date range? Is it going to be by activity? What do you have, the most of? How can you chunk it out? So we did it by region. And as I mentioned, then it got converted over to Alaska Native corporations. And you have to get help, really. I think that almost every year we went to AFN, we could have used more help, more hands. It was much more productive to sit with people and listen to their stories and talk with them about the photographs and help them respond to the photographs and remember, than to just hand them a pencil and be done with it. I think the more people thought and reflected, the more they remembered. So it's great if you have enough people to help. And then make sure you have enough places for people to sit, because you're going to get people who are older. Those are the people who tend to like to look at these things, and you need to have somewhere for them to be comfortable in the time that they're going to look at these photographs. Also, you don't want to underestimate how much time it's going to take you to take all the information you've just gotten and do something useful with it. So don't think that you're going to come back and immediately just be able to share all of the information that you got with your researchers. You're going to have to think about what is what's the biggest bang for the buck, right? So I often worked on incorporating some of that data into the guides immediately when I got back, because I knew that, for example, a daughter who saw a photo of a father at AFN was then going to tell cousins that the image was in the collection, and if the cousins wanted a copy, they should contact us. So we often got follow-up requests right after AFN, in the month or two following. People would come to the museum if they lived in Anchorage and want to see it in person, the actual physical photograph. We would get requests for more scans. We would get requests for, hey, I saw that you had that one photo of Myers Chuck. Do you have any more? Now I'm doing a book, and hey, I wanted to follow up with you. So if I had gotten all that information in the guides, it would be really easy for any staff person to find the photo that a member of the public was asking for. And then once you do it more than once, you get the snowball rolling, and you just sort of incorporate it into your workflow, and it makes it a lot easier. But getting started can seem pretty daunting. So I think if you start fairly small and you get a positive results, it can really help if you just build on a small project with some success. So another one of the lessons that we learned over the years at AFN is that it really matters who you know, and it's great if you can get people to go out and be ambassadors for you to bring more people back to where you are, where your project is set up. So after 2013, we saw some of the same people come to the table in 2014. Every year I took new photos. So people would come back to the table because they would remember that they had fun the last time. And after a while, a few of those people really became advocates, and they would go and they would get their friends and their family and they would drag them back to our table to look at photos and giggle and reminisce. They would come there and they would see people they hadn't seen in a long time, and they would even if they didn't necessarily recognize anyone in a photograph, they would say, oh, remember we used to have something just like that, and do you remember that time that we kids went out and we took the boat out? And they would just sit and tell their stories to each other, and it would be an enjoyable experience for them, and they would want to come back and do it the next year. So as we developed really a relationship with some of those people that would come to the table, that's when I really started to feel that the way that I was presenting these photos was maybe not serving the community as well as it could. And I had heard for a few years in a row that what people really wanted was to look at not maybe a North folder, but they wanted to look at a NANA folder. People would sit down and I would say, where are you from? And they would tell me the name of their native corporation. And unfortunately, for many, many years, I didn't feel like I could distinguish between native corporation territories. And I felt very uncomfortable with the idea of doing it that way, because the way I was chunking things out geographically was just literally based on like types of trees and like, are there any mountains in the pictures? So when I did make the transition to organizing it in the way that the attendees suggested, which was by native corporation, and I felt really a little uncertain about how well I had done in sorting things out, I found that people were much more receptive to grabbing a folder with their native corporation name on it and then shuffling things around for me. They're like, no, that doesn't go there, that goes over here. And they would literally just take photos out of one folder and jam them into another. Or they'd just hand it to the person next to them and say, hey, this looks more like your area. And it was because so many attendees of AFN were very focused on their native corporations and the way those political structures sort of organize their communities, because I mean, that's what they're doing there at AFN, right? So I think maybe in another context, doing it geographically would have continued to make more sense. But for AFN, they wanted that kind of political division, and it just resonated really impressively with people. And I wish I'd had more years of doing it that way under my belt to compare and contrast, but it really seemed to amplify those connections I was trying to foster. So you always want to listen to people. I should have listened earlier, but I didn't. Other lessons learned, right, is that humans are fallible. They are never, ever totally correct. I'm never totally correct. I don't know anyone who's ever totally correct. Some people spell really well and some people do not. Some people remember their grandparents' maiden names and some people do not. Some, cousins remember that, an auntie was named, Clara and not Charlotte. So there was a lot of conflicting information that we would get. People would, they did not hesitate to question each other, let's put it that way. And there were a number of times when I felt like the table was the site of a little bit of warfare between families or between townships, where people wanted to claim some piece of history or not claim some piece of history as theirs. We also had every year there was some individual or other who would sit down and claim to know everything about everything and everyone, and would write on all the pictures, and what turned out to be totally false information. And I think, sometimes people would do that because they wanted to look like they knew something. They wanted to look like they knew more about their culture than they did. And you just have to be on guard for that kind of behavior. We also had a number of incidents in which a group of people would sit down and begin to speak, often in not in a language other than English, in Yupik or in Biak, and they would be having a heck of a time. They would be giggling and telling stories and pointing at people, and clearly knew who they were and what was going on. And then if I asked them to write something down, they would not. So I never tried to push people to share information that they didn't want to share. I think there's a lot of secrecy around culture for lots of different reasons, right? And you just have to respect that sometimes people do not want to tell you what they know. And that has got to be their choice. And you just have to accept that you're just not going to get that piece of information, and move on. You just have to appreciate that you've given them, a few giggles and a good time. So the most that you can do really is try to start a conversation with people when they show interest in a project like this, and try to get them to start talking about maybe what they do remember or what they did know, or what kinds of images they might want to see. And even if they only know maybe what is being gathered in a photograph, like what is that native food that people are gathering, or what would you call that style of parka. Just try to get people talking and just write down what they say. Oh, here are some of my favorite examples of conflicting information. So this was, one of these photos. I had no idea. I don't even know if this is Alaska. It certainly doesn't look like it might be Alaska. But lots of people thought it was Haines, and then they would write down Haines, and then someone would cross it out, and then someone else would write down Haines, and someone would write down Sitka. And there's this conversation that goes on back and forth between successive people as they sit down. Here is what turned out to be actually a cannery in Ketchikan, but it took years of conversations between people to get to this point. And some people thought it was not a cannery. It had so many windows in it, it couldn't possibly be a cannery. It had to be a bunkhouse. And and it's really hard to know sometimes for the non-specialist what to believe and what to prioritize. And if you cannot verify, just including all of the information that you've received to, lead people who might be interested in the history of canneries, for example, to this image, the more people with a certain interest who see it, the more likely it is to be identified positively. But this was a number of years of going back to AFN and bringing the same photo and leaving all of the information on there. People writing things down, crossing it off, putting on their little question marks. This was one where someone had identified it as treadmill in Juneau, and even I knew that that was probably not correct. And then it turns out that somebody remembered that long ago, it's since completely disappeared. This was part of the Yakutat and Southern Railroad. And sure enough, once you have a little clue like that, you can go and maybe find related images and verify. But we started out having taken this, and somebody said it's definitely Haynes, and then somebody said no, that's not Haynes. This is definitely the treadmill mine in Juneau. And then, lo and behold, with certainty, when someone writes in giant capital letters that this is the roundhouse for the Yakutat and Southern Railroad. And in a delightfully sort of personal comment here, somebody wrote down Charlie Jones ? And somebody who was related to Charlie Jones sat down and said, that's not Grandpa Charlie. He had a mustache. So that clearly that can't be him. I don't know how honest that could be, because certainly mustaches can be shaved. So, we undertook this project for many, many years, and I personally got a lot of enjoyment from it, and a lot of satisfaction from just going and talking to people. I think if we hadn't identified, if we'd only gotten a 20% completion rate, I think I still would have felt as satisfied, because people were so pleased to see that we were even making the effort. And that's really what I remember, and that's really what continues to resonate with me. And that's the reason that I would recommend that anybody undertake this kind of a project. The Anchorage Museum happened to get some awards for this project because it was seen as innovative and groundbreaking and history in progress. And to me, it just seems so obvious when you think about it, right? Somebody took this photograph in a place, and the photo is of a person, and clearly there were other people there at that time. Who would have known what this place is and who these people are? And all you need to do is go and find those people and ask them, who is this? And it seems like the easiest thing in the world to do, to take these photos back to the places they were taken and let everyone enjoy them, let everyone see them, because what is the point of having them if you're not going to do that? So, as nice as it was to get some recognition for this, it really seemed to me the whole time that I was doing it that I can't believe I didn't do it sooner. It seemed like I had just been remiss in trying to identify these all myself. And I didn't do anyone any good for all the years I didn't go to AFN and ask people about these things. So I certainly, I think it was a great success. And hopefully that information that we gathered about those images continues to serve people through the future. So that's all I have to say today about this project. Thank you for listening and for watching. Here is my personal email. I'm no longer at the Anchorage Museum, as I mentioned, even though I refer to us as we a lot through the presentation. The Anchorage Museum does still have an archives. They still have archivists, and they can be reached at the email and the phone number listed here. So again, thank you for listening. Chinan.